Good evening, my friends, and welcome. Come in from the chill, shake the frost from your coat, and settle yourself beside the fire. Outside, the world is painted silver, icicles hanging from the eaves, the ground crisp beneath a pale moon. But here, there's warmth, a kettle singing softly, and the comfort of a well-worn armchair. Tonight, we turn our thoughts to a tale both enchanting and unsettling, deadly games at the Frost Fair. Beneath the glow of lanterns and the laughter of winter revelry, a darker story stays, waiting to be uncovered. But before we begin, tell me, what's your favorite winter tradition? Do you favor mulled wine, the thrill of skating, or simply losing yourself in a book by the fire? The Thames lay frozen solid, transformed into a wonderland of light and sound. Lanterns swayed in the frosty air, casting golden halos across rows of makeshift stalls where vendors sold hot pies, sugared almonds, and steaming cups of spiced wine. Jugglers tossed bright pins against the dark sky. Skaters traced quicksilver lines across the ice, and children shrieked with delight as fiddlers struck up lively tunes. It was the Frost Fair, rare, dazzling, unforgettable. Yet beneath the merriment, something faintly discordant hummed. Shadows seemed to move more deliberately than the crowd. Laughter rose a little too sharply, and at one dice table, tension thickened like the breath hanging in the air. A nobleman, velvet cloak sweeping the ice, leaned in with a gambler's grin. He rolled. The dice clattered, showing snake eyes. His laughter caught in his throat, then cut short. He swayed, collapsed, and the phased cheer froze into silence. As panic rippled outward, only one figure remained composed. Miss Marple, wrapped in a plain wool coat, observed from a modest stall. While others shouted of poison or curse, she noticed small truths: the untouched rim of a cup, a stranger's swift retreat, the peculiar stillness of the fallen man's hand. Chapter 1: Whispers on the Ice. The frost that year was unlike any in memory. Days of biting cold had turned the Thames into a glittering plain, thick enough to bear wagons, tents, and the weight of a village's curiosity. Word spread quickly, and soon families bundled in wool and fur made their way down to the river, their breath clouding the air as bells chimed from distant steeples. The Frost Fair was no ordinary market. It was a festival sprung from nature's hand, fleeting and magical. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, desperate for sweetmeats. Men wagered on skating races, coins flashing in the pale light. Women bartered for trinkets fashioned from bone and glass. Laughter mingled with the scent of roasted chestnuts, and for a moment, the hardships of winter seemed forgotten. Yet under the merriment ran whispers, old wives' tales carried from hearth to hearth. Beware the games of chance, one woman warned, clutching her shawl tighter. The ice remembers sin. Another muttered that dice, when rolled upon frozen water, could call up ill fortune. Though the villagers laughed nervously, a shiver passed through them all. For every lantern that glowed warmly, there was a shadow stretching long across the ice, hinting that not all joys were without price. The dice rattled across the rough wooden board, tumbling end over end before clattering to a halt. For a breathless moment, the crowd leaned in as one, the lantern light catching the ivory cubes where they lay. Snake eyes! A low murmur swept through the circle, half amusement, half unease, for in the folklore of the Thames, such a throw was never taken lightly. The nobleman, draped in velvet and silver trim, laughed richly, his cheeks flushed from wine and victory. Yet even as the chuckle left his lips, it broke into a sharp gasp. His hand flew to his throat, dice slipping from his grasp, clattering onto the ice once more. Eyes wide, he staggered, then collapsed to his knees. His laughter curdled into silence. At first, there was disbelief. Someone shouted for help, another crossed themselves, and then panic surged like a sudden storm. Women screamed. Children were swept away into the arms of their fathers. A jug of mulled wine spilled, the crimson liquid spreading like a stain across the frosted boards. "Poison!" a voice cried. "It's a curse!" another shrieked. In the confusion, suspicion flared wildly. Was it the dice, hexed by fortune, or had some unseen hand slipped venom into his drink? The music faltered, jugglers ceased mid-throw, and the frost fair, moments before alive with laughter, fell into a chaos of fear. Only the ice beneath them remained steady, cold and unyielding, as though it alone bore witness to the truth of what had just unfolded. Amid the cries and confusion, one figure did not rush, did not flail, did not surrender to fear. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, her pale eyes watching with a clarity that belied her age. Where others saw calamity, she saw patterns forming, details arranging themselves like pieces of lace. Her gaze fell first upon the overturned cup, the mulled wine staining the snow a deep, unnatural red. Most stepped around it without thought, but she noted how the nobleman had scarcely touched it, the rim still clean, unsmudged. Then her eyes caught the fleeting motion of a man in a scarlet scarf, slipping quietly through the dispersing crowd. While voices rose in speculation, he disappeared with deliberate ease, as though he had been waiting for just such a commotion. Lastly, she observed the nobleman's hand. It lay too still, the fingers oddly rigid, as if seized by something more than sudden weakness. Such stiffness suggested not chance, but design. All around her, villagers clutched their children and cursed the night. Superstitions flew as readily as the snowflakes drifting down from the dark sky. Yet Miss Marple remained calm, almost serene. She knew from long experience that answers seldom lay in shouts and rumors. They lived, instead, in the quiet, overlooked spaces, the very places where she had always been most at home. Chapter 2: Shadows Beneath Lantern Light. By the time the shaken crowd retreated from the riverbank, the inns along the Thames were already humming with talk. The nobleman's body had been carried away under a cloak, but the story of his collapse lingered, multiplying with every retelling. In the warmth of firelit taverns, tankards of ale were raised, slammed down, and passed along with speculation sharper than any blade. Why would a gentleman of his standing be dicing with hawkers and fishmongers? One man scoffed, leaning heavily on the counter. It smacks of desperation. Another lowered his voice, insisting the man was ruined by debts, chased from London by creditors. A woman in the corner claimed she'd once seen him in a coach with a veiled lady not his wife, and the room hummed at the scandal. Others whispered of feuds, old quarrels stretching back to duels fought on frosty mornings, grudges never laid to rest. With each rumor, the nobleman became less a victim of cruel fate and more a man entangled in his own sins. The fire crackled, shadows leaping against the walls, as the whispers thickened like smoke. By midnight, the frost fair's glittering gaiety had vanished from memory, replaced by the darker thrill of suspicion. As the night deepened, a curious thread began to weave itself through the tangle of speculation. More than one villager recalled a stranger, a tall figure wrapped in a vivid scarlet scarf, standing close to the dice table when the nobleman fell. The color was striking, impossible to miss against the pallor of snow and lantern light. Yet, oddly, when the panic broke, no one could say where the man had gone. Miss Marple, with her quiet manner and kindly smile, moved gently among the vendors still dismantling their stalls. She asked no direct accusations, only soft questions, the sort that invited memory rather than defensiveness. "And did you notice his hands? Were they gloved? Did he carry a bag?" she inquired, as though remarking on the weather. The answers varied wildly. A baker swore the man had been drinking heavily, stumbling with laughter. A skater insisted he stood perfectly still, never moving except to adjust his scarf. One woman said he had dark hair, another, light. A boy thought he saw a limp. A fiddler was certain he walked briskly, strong as an ox. The contradictions piled up, like snowflakes that refused to settle into order. Miss Marple listened without complaint, her expression mild, but inwardly she noted that the very inconsistency of the accounts suggested something deliberate. A man could not be tall and short, drunk and sober, limping and spry, unless, of course, he wished to be remembered differently by each witness. The scarlet scarf blazed bright in every recollection, and perhaps that was the point. A distraction, a mask, a carefully chosen flourish that allowed everything else, face, voice, bearing, to blur into forgetfulness. And in that forgetfulness, danger might yet be hiding. By dawn, the talk had shifted from shadows and scarves to objects more tangible. The dice, some claimed, were bewitched. Snake eyes, 2 throws in a row, muttered a boatman, shaking his head. No honest cubes fall like that. Others swore it was the mulled wine, rich and spiced but masking something bitter beneath. The constable gathered the dice and the cup, laying them out upon a scarred oak table at the inn. The villagers crowded close, eager to see mischief revealed. To most eyes, the ivory cubes appeared ordinary, their pips dark and clean, their weight no different than any others. The cup, too, seemed unremarkable save for its lingering sweetness of cloves. But Miss Marple leaned in, peering with quiet interest. She turned the dice gently between her fingers, noting a faint discoloration along the edges, as if someone had handled them with dampened fingertips, too often, too carefully. She tapped them against the wood, listening to the sound. Slightly off, she thought. Just enough to matter. Then she lifted the cup. The rim was untouched, unstained, which troubled her more than if it had been smeared. A man flushed with drink would have left his mark. Instead, the stain lay at the bottom, faint and crystalline, where only a trained eye might notice. Others dismissed these details. Mere trifles, they said, the fancy of an old woman. But Miss Marple knew better. The truth, she reflected, was often stitched not into grand gestures, but into the smallest seams. Chapter 3. Old Secret Surface. The dead man's name, once whispered only in rumor, soon passed from lip to lip with growing confidence. Lord Christopher Redmayne, known in certain London circles for his charm, his wit, and his flair at the gaming tables. To the casual acquaintance, he was a gentleman of enviable style, a patron of theatre, a companion quick with laughter. Yet beneath that polished veneer lay debts heavy enough to bow any man's shoulders. Letters recovered from his effects hinted at desperate wages lost and creditors growing impatient. Some were written in fine, delicate hands, pleas from a woman whose affection had soured into bitterness, a love affair cut short by betrayal. Others bore the blunt script of men whose fortunes were tied to the river docks and whose patience was thinner than the ice that now held the frost fair aloft. The villagers, thrilled to weave scandal into tragedy, muttered of midnight meetings, of fortunes won dishonorably, of enemies dressed as friends. He was a man who left both admiration and resentment in his wake, and it was difficult to say which ran deeper. What was certain, however, was that Lord Redmayne had not wandered innocently to the Frost Fair that night. He had carried with him the weight of secrets, and perhaps someone else's vengeance. Morning light revealed a different fair than the one remembered in song and laughter. Where lanterns had shimmered golden, the sun struck cold and pale across the river, turning the ice into a glassy mirror that reflected every flaw. The stalls still stood, their banners limp with frost, but the air lacked the sparkle of enchantment. What had felt like a wonderland in the glow of night now seemed brittle, fragile, and somehow watchful. Miss Marple walked quietly among the remnants. Vendors spoke in hushed tones, their voices lowered as though daylight made the tragedy sharper, less dreamlike. The music was gone. Only the wind sang faintly over the frozen surface. Her eyes, sharp despite their softness, caught what others overlooked. Near the dice table, faint scuffs in the snow suggested hurried footsteps, overlapping and confused, as though more than one person had slipped away in haste. At the edge of the fair, where shadows clung beneath a row of tents, she found the imprint of two figures who had stood close together, their boots leaving deep impressions side by side. Not casual passers-by, she thought, but a meeting, furtive, urgent. The villagers saw only the aftermath of a tragedy. Miss Marple saw a stage where every detail had been arranged, every mark in the snow part of a pattern. Daylight stripped away the enchantment, and in its clarity, she began to sense how carefully the pieces of this puzzle had been laid upon the ice. As stories continued to ripple through the village, another thread began to surface, half-whispered at first, then spoken more boldly. Several fairgoers recalled a woman in a dark veil standing at the edge of the dice game. While most cheered or groaned at each throw, she had remained tense, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her, as though bracing for a blow. Some swore they saw her flinch the moment Lord Redmayne collapsed, as if the shock had pierced her more deeply than any stranger's misfortune should. Miss Marple, intrigued, sought out those who had noticed her. But the accounts grew hazy. One recalled the veil was jet black, another insisted it had been edged with lace. A fishmonger claimed she hurried away toward the bridge, while a milkmaid swore she vanished into the crowd without a trace. No one had spoken to her, no one could say her name. Later, as the villagers picked over the fairgrounds, a small object was found in the snow, a single glove, embroidered delicately at the cuff with initials half-faded by damp. Its fine stitching spoke of wealth, but its presence there, abandoned, spoke of haste. Miss Marple turned the glove over in her hands, her expression unreadable. Whoever the veiled woman was, she had been close enough to watch, close enough to care, and close enough, perhaps, to know the truth. Chapter 4. The game turns darker. The inn, usually a refuge of warmth and ale, had become a pressure cooker. The low beams rattled with raised voices. The hearth spat sparks as though echoing the tempers within. Men and women who only yesterday shared mugs and cheer now eyed one another with suspicion sharpened by fear. "He owed me 50 guineas, barked a portly merchant, slamming his palm against the table. "And he swore he'd pay it back last night." "A lie," countered a lank-haired fellow near the fire. "He promised me first, said I'd be repaid with interest." "And what of the ring he wore? Missing, isn't it? I say one of you took it while he lay dying." Gasps circled the room, accusations flying faster than tankards could be filled. A jealous husband muttered about the veiled woman, swearing she'd met Redmayne in secret. A rival gambler sneered that the dice had been tampered with, not by fate but by another man's hand. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. She knew human nature often revealed itself under heat, and here, under the inn's smoky rafters, truth began to bubble up like stew left too long on the boil. Betrayals, debts, jealousies, each voice added fuel to the fire, and somewhere within the uproar, the outline of a darker truth began to take shape. The next afternoon, when the fair lay quieter beneath a pale winter sun, Miss Marple took to the river alone. Her boots pressed crisp imprints into the ice, the faint crunch echoing in the stillness. She let her thoughts drift back over the fragments of the night before. The dice rolling strangely, the untouched rim of the cup, the scarlet scarf that burned too brightly in every memory, the veiled woman's tense silhouette. Each detail threaded itself into her mind like stitches forming a pattern. Yet the river, so lively hours before, felt uncanny now. The laughter was gone, replaced by the groan of shifting ice beneath her steps. Miss Marple paused near a crack spiting across the surface, bending slightly to examine where the snow had been disturbed, as though someone had stood there recently, watching. It was then she felt it, a sudden, deliberate shove against her shoulder. She lurched forward, arms flailing, the crack yawning darkly beneath her. For a heartbeat, the cold black water seemed to beckon. But with surprising steadiness, she righted herself, her walking stick catching against the ice, pulling her back. When she turned, the river was empty. No figure, no sound but the whispering wind. Yet she knew this had not been chance. Someone feared her quiet questions, feared what she might uncover. The shove had been a warning, subtle enough to pass as accident, lethal enough had she not been quick. Drawing her coat tighter, Miss Marple resumed her walk, her breath rising in frosty plumes. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and the shadow behind them had grown aware of her. Later that evening, as stores were packed away and the river grew quiet, a small discovery slipped almost unnoticed into Miss Marple's hands. A boy, cheeks red from the cold, had found it near the abandoned dice table and brought it to her with shy curiosity. A wooden dice box, its lid worn smooth, its hinges stiff with frost. At first glance it seemed ordinary, well-made, but unremarkable among the trinkets scattered across the frost fare. Yet as Miss Marple brushed away the snow clinging to its side, she caught sight of something others had missed. Carved faintly into the wood were initials, C.R. Christopher Redmayne. The victim's own hand, perhaps, or a gift, marked to tie it to him. But why then would it be discarded, left behind carelessly after the chaos? Turning the box over, Miss Marple felt the weight inside, heavier than expected. When opened, 2 dice tumbled out, identical to those that had rolled snake eyes upon the table. Yet these bore subtle marks, tiny scratches near the pips, the sort used by clever cheats to control a fall. The initials linked the object directly to Lord Redmayne, but the workmanship of the dice suggested a more insidious truth. Someone close to him had crafted or procured these. Someone who knew his habits well enough to lace his pleasures with peril. The box was no trifling relic. It was a signature, an unintentional confession. And with it, suspicion shifted, pointing toward a hand no one had dared yet to suspect. Chapter 5: Revelations on the Ice. The frost fair glittered once more beneath a canopy of lanterns, music drifting lightly across the ice as though the tragedy of the night before had never occurred. Children laughed, couples skated hand in hand, and vendors cried out their wares. Yet at the far edge of the river, away from the merriment, a smaller, more somber gathering formed. Miss Marple had requested their presence with the gentlest of words, and curiosity, or perhaps unease, had drawn them in. The innkeeper, the rival gambler, the merchant who claimed debts, the veiled woman now unmasked but pale with dread, even the fiddler who swore he had seen the scarlet scarf. They stood together in a loose circle, their breath misting the air, their eyes darting between one another. Behind them, the fair blazed with color and sound, but here the silence was taut as wire. It was as if 2 worlds coexisted upon the same ice, one alive with joy, the other waiting for truth to be laid bare. Miss Marple, modest in her woolen coat, seemed almost out of place, an elderly lady among a crowd of restless suspects. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried with quiet authority. "We have, I think, reached the point where questions must become answers," she said softly, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "For though laughter fills the fair, there is still one shadow upon the ice, and it will not vanish until the truth is named. The circle shifted uneasily as Miss Marple folded her hands before her. The lantern light caught the frost in her hair, giving her the appearance of a figure both gentle and unyielding. Lord Redmayne's death was not the whim of fate, she began. It was planned, carefully, patiently, and with intent. The dice, though they seemed to seal his fortune, were never the true weapon. They were a symbol, chosen to mock him in his last moments, for gambling was both his vice and his ruin. A murmur rippled through the group, some scoffing, others paling. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the wooden box in her hands, the engraved initials catching the light. The poison, she continued, was not slipped to him by a stranger in the crowd. It was delivered in the cup of mulled wine, handed to him by one he trusted. Not a chance passing of drink, but a deliberate offering. He scarcely touched it, yet enough had been taken to seal his fate. His laughter choked because it was never laughter alone. It was a moment the venom claimed him. Gasps followed. Accusations hissed into the air, but Miss Marple raised a hand. No curse, no witchcraft, no devil in the dice. Only human hands, guided by anger and wounded pride. Revenge was poured into that cup, masked with cloves and cinnamon. The dice were there only to distract, to lead the eye away from the quiet, deadly act already done. The fae's music drifted faintly behind them, a jarring counterpoint to the chill of her words. And within the tense circle, faces shifted, some indignant, some fearful, as the truth pressed closer. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to crystallize around them, sharp with expectation. Miss Marple's eyes, clear and steady, came to rest on the veiled woman. "It was you?" she said softly, without malice. Not the mysterious stranger the crowd imagined. The scarlet scarf was no man's flourish. It was your disguise. A clever trick. While they squabbled over whether he was tall or short, drunk or sober, they overlooked the truth. You wished to be remembered differently by each witness. And so you wrapped yourself in colors too bold to be forgotten, ensuring everything else about you blurred. The woman's gloved hands trembled. Her lips parted as though to protest, but the sound caught in her throat. You loved Lord Redmayne once, Miss Marple continued gently. But he betrayed you, ruined your reputation, left you with nothing while he chased pleasure elsewhere. Your heart and your fortune were both cast aside. You did not seek mere justice, but retribution, and the frost fair gave you both the crowd and the cover. A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. The woman bowed her head, the veil sliding to reveal eyes glistening with fury and grief. He deserved it, she whispered at last. Perhaps so, Miss Marple thought silently. Yet in her experience, vengeance rarely warmed the heart as much as it burned it to ash. The frost fair lived on, as though determined to outshine the darkness that had momentarily threatened to snuff it out. Lanterns swung gently in the night breeze, their golden glow flickering across faces flushed with laughter. Skaters skimmed over the frozen river, their blades cutting crisp lines that vanished as quickly as they formed. Musicians struck up fiddles and drums, and children darted between stalls clutching sugar-dusted sweets. Life returned, eager to reclaim its joy. And yet, for those who had stood within Miss Marple's circle, the merriment carried a different note. Beneath the music and cheer lingered the faint echo of silence, the memory of a nobleman's laughter breaking into a choke, and the revelation that beneath every smile at the fair might lurk a secret. Joy and malice, light and shadow, bound together as inseparably as frost upon the river's glassy surface. Miss Marple, never one to linger where spectacle threatened to eclipse sense, wrapped her shawl tightly and prepared to leave. She had no interest in being hailed or thanked. Her satisfaction lay only in truth being spoken aloud. As her carriage wheels crunched over the frozen road, she reflected with quiet melancholy. How curious it was, she thought, that the same lanterns which lit children's games could also illuminate acts of vengeance. That in the same breath, a crowd could cheer, and one heart could break so bitterly it sought retribution. For those who believe the woman's act justified, perhaps the frost fair would always carry a strange allure. Justice served beneath the guise of festivity. But for Miss Marple, it was another reminder that human hearts, like winter ice, are fragile things, capable of holding the weight of life, but just as easily fractured by betrayal. And now, dear friends, we come to the end of tonight's tale, Deadly Games at the Frost Fair. Thank you for joining me by the fireside, for lending your imagination to lantern-lit streets, to whispered superstitions, and to a mystery stitched into the very fabric of winter itself. But before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What detail first caught your suspicion? Was it the stranger's scarlet scarf, the untouched rim of the mulled wine, or the dice box carved with initials? Would you have pieced the puzzle together, or might the truth have slipped beneath your feet like black water under thin ice? Do share your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading each one. And if this mystery has kindled your appetite for more, do remember to subscribe, so that next week, when the kettle sings again and the night grows long, you'll be back here beside the fire for another story. Until then, keep warm, keep curious, and may the frost never crack beneath your step. Good night.